You're now watching Around the Horne, the weekly internationalist news update with author and historian Gerald Horne.
Today is July 23rd, 2025. Welcome everyone to the weekly series entitled Around the Horne, which is an internationalist news update with historian and Professor Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne's latest book, which was just released and is now in print and now available on the International Publisher's website, is entitled The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., from 1800 to 1865. Dr. Horne is also a permanent guest on the radio show, The Horne Report, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and Dr. Horne also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific. And replays of both shows can be found on the Activist News Network. And on the anniversary of the Cuban Revolution, July 26th, Dr. Horne will be speaking in honor of the Cuban Revolution at 7 p.m. at 600 Campbell Avenue in Vancouver, British Columbia. Dr. Horne, thank you for coming back on the show, and welcome back to Around the Horne.
Thank you for inviting me, and let me reiterate the latter point, that is to say, this event in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada on Saturday, because I think it's important to give Cuba and the Cuban Revolution its flowers. What I mean is that the Cuban Revolution, coincidentally enough, inaugurated 155 years after the Haitian Revolution, culminating in victory in January 1, 1804, with both being of world historic significance. Cuba and Cuban socialism accelerates the general crisis of white supremacy, not least by defeating the apartheid military on the battlefields of Southern Africa, just like the Haitian Revolution accelerated the general crisis of slavery, which it did, not least in North America. You may recall that it was 50 years ago, in November 1975, if not a few weeks earlier, wherein the Havana regime dispatched thousands of troops to Angola to foil an invasion backed by the United States Central Intelligence Agency, spearheaded by apartheid South Africa, designed to foil true independence. And it's also important to mention that approximately 13 years later, at the Battle of Quito Cuanavale in southern Angola, you saw the Cubans at the forefront of a military formation that included Angolans, included the Mkhonto we Sizwe of the African National Congress of South Africa, that included the armed wing of SWAPO, the Southwest Africa People's Organization, that inflicted a mighty body blow, once again, on the apartheid military, which opened the door to serious negotiations culminating in the first democratic elections in South Africa in 1994, leading to the ascension of Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress, all of which is detailed in the book on your screen. I should also mention that the earlier intervention by Cubans in 1975 in Angola also softened up the racist regime in neighboring Zimbabwe, causing the Rhodesians to fear that if they were not more reasonable, then they too would have to battle the Cubans on the battlefield, making them more susceptible to sweet reason and negotiations. And it's a marvelous story of Black Cubans in particular returning to Africa and defeating the white supremacy that undergirded the African slave trade. And then after that, we see that Cuban socialism dispatched doctors and surgeons and nurses and healthcare workers to Africa and the Caribbean in particular to tend to the wounds and tend to the health of so many Black people in particular. Actually, this humanitarian project began as early as 1962 with Algerian independence. And so, unsurprisingly, today, we see U.S. imperialism seeking to strangle the revolution. And that's why I'm recommending a tactic or a project to our Canadian friends that they begin a systematic picket of the U.S. consulate in Vancouver, not to mention Toronto and Montreal. And of course, this could be taken up in Manhattan at Federal Plaza, downtown Manhattan, or in Los Angeles at the Federal Building in Westwood, with a demand not only of ending the cruel and inhumane blockade embargo of socialist Cuba, but also in the case of Canada, for example, protests against this madness of Canada becoming the 51st state, and as well protesting against these inhumane immigration policies, which we will be discussing rather shortly.
Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about the 100th birthday of Frantz Fanon. On July 20th, 1925, revolutionary political philosopher Frantz Fanon was born in the French colony of Martinique. Fanon was a Pan-Africanist and a Marxist humanist who has dealt with the psychopathology of colonization and the human, social, and cultural consequences of decolonization. Fanon supported the Algerian War of Independence from France, and his works have inspired national liberation movements and other radical political organizations in Palestine, Sri Lanka, South Africa, and the United States. As settler colonial and class collaborationist violence escalate across the globe from Kanaki to Palestine, it appears that Fanon's century-old warnings remain not just relevant, but critical today. In addition, like yourself, Fanon raised the ever-important lumpen question. As such, Dr. Horne, what is the historical importance and legacy of Frantz Fanon in 2025?
Well, first of all, I would say internationalism. As has been suggested, he was born in the Caribbean, but made his mark in Algeria, in North Africa, where he served faithfully the Algerian Revolution up to and including independence in 1962. I should also say that this is not unusual. We reference the Cuban Revolution, and inescapably tied to the revolution in Cuba is the heroism of the Argentine, speaking of Ernesto Che Guevara. Or we can mention W.E.B. Du Bois, born in Massachusetts, who winds up serving Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana before his passing from the scene in 1963. Certainly, he left with us a small library of works that are worthy of scrutiny even to this very day: The Wretched of the Earth, Black Skins, White Mass, amongst others. And certainly, Fanon had to spend time justifying the legitimacy of violence by the oppressed. And I say those terms in particular because the imperialists and the colonialists, obviously they use violence to get where they are to this very day, but somehow violence should not be in the toolkit of those who they are oppressing. And with regard to the lumpen, and I've said quite a bit about that in the book on the screen and on the book I Dare Say and other works also as well. But just recently in Los Angeles, California, you had the vice mayor, Cynthia Gonzalez, of a small suburb in LA County that's 98% Latino. And she called out the cholos, the so-called gangbangers of her town and her county, because she was wondering why weren't they, in their usual macho fashion, confronting the ICE and the immigration authorities as they were bombarding their sisters and brothers in the Mexican American and Latino community and in the Mexican immigrant community. And I think that Vice Mayor Gonzalez raised a useful point, which is that we have to be careful with regard to turning lumpen elements into heroes. I mean, why is it that the cholos have to be reminded that they need to be in the streets protecting their community? If they were the sort of vanguard that some have envisioned them to be, they would not need an elected official to tell them to protect brown folk as they're being rounded up unceremoniously by the white supremacist regime in Washington. But in any case, we should once again take a moment or two to salute the heroic Frantz Fanon. His legacy will live forever, I dare say.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, First, we want to talk to you about the expansion of immigration and customs enforcement, known as ICE. President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill Act provides more than $170 billion in new funding for immigration enforcement and detention. In fact, the new budget would make ICE the single largest federal law enforcement agency in the history of the nation, thus making ICE the largest domestic law enforcement agency, with a scale and budget higher than most of the world's militaries, including Israel's. With an annual average budget of $37.5 billion, ICE's budget is higher than the military expenditure of all but 15 countries in the world. In addition, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act allocates another $45 billion towards immigrant detention, which is larger than the budget of the entire U.S. federal prison system. Dr. Horne, how concerned should all of us be regarding this gross expansion of ICE's budget? And it is possible to accurately analyze or critique this wild expansion of ICE without uttering the words settler colonialism and class collaboration?
Indeed. In fact, part of our headlines today in today's press have been stories, number one, about Republicans in Washington seeking to denaturalize the electoral victor in New York City in the mayoral primary, speaking of Mr. Mamdani, which is quite extraordinary. Here you have a man on the verge of becoming the next occupant of City Hall in Manhattan, and the Republicans are talking about taking away his U.S. citizenship and presumably shipping him back to Uganda. And then number two, we were reminded once again that Mr. Trump seeks not only to send undocumented workers to an uncertain fate in Djibouti or South Sudan or the country formerly known as Swaziland, but also, as he suggests, send U.S. nationals to these particular sites. And here reference the previous story about Mexican Americans actually being rounded up in the streets of Los Angeles and being detained by the authorities in Los Angeles County. Now, I have before me the Financial Times article from July 16th, 2025. You ought to be able to find this online. It's a very interesting takeout of some of the economic consequences of this spectacular hike in the budget of ICE. And this ties in directly to the investment fortunes of Geo Group and Core Civic and other elements of what had been the prison industrial complex. They run private prisons, but now they expect to benefit handsomely and bountifully from the fact that the number of detainees by the U.S. authorities is expected to go up spectacularly in terms of the arrest and detention of immigrants and undocumented workers. Now, what's curious is that these particular entities, Geo Group in particular, that they are akin to airlines. Airlines don't make money if they take off with empty planes. And likewise, Geo Group needs to put heads in those beds of those immigration detention facilities, which creates an incentive for them to round up undocumented workers in a ruthless fashion. And already you see warnings coming from Canada in particular, a warning this nation of the north, the northern border of the United States, that their nationals should be very careful in terms of traveling to the United States of America, because there are already very disturbing stories about Canadian nationals being detained. We already know all too well stories about those of Cuban ancestry being detained, those of Mexican ancestry being detained. And this is a very disturbing story, not least because it raises the specter of providing material incentives for this sort of brutal measure. That is to say, the rounding up of folks willy-nilly on these shores, and not only putting them in these Geo Group detention centers, but perhaps shipping them to Africa, as we mentioned last week, a major import of this mini summit of African leaders from West Africa, just taking place in the last week or so, was requesting that they receive folks from the United States that the United States would like to ship away to an uncertain fate. Fortunately, the government of Nigeria turned thumbs down on this harebrained scheme, but unfortunately and sadly, other West African nations are not as powerful and influential as oil-producing Nigeria and may not be able to resist the arm twisting of the Trump regime. So certainly, this is just one more reason to protest this big, ugly bill, and one more reason why folks should be picketing the federal facilities in Lower Manhattan, in Los Angeles and Westwood, not to mention north of the border in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, first I want to ask you about Syria. Starting on July 14th, the Israeli military carried out a handful of airstrikes against Syrian military units in the Suwaida region. And on July 15th, Israel carried even more substantial airstrikes. And then on July 16th, Israeli aircraft struck Damascus, hitting the Syrian Defense Ministry and struck sites near the presidential palace. As a result, the Syrian forces withdrew from Suwaida, and under relentless pressure from Israel, the Syrian government agreed to cease fire. But the underlying Druze Bedouin violence continued and seemed to escalate. Syrian security forces redeployed into Suwaida on July 19th after the Trump administration, which is back to leaking claims that it is frustrated with the Israeli government, brokered a ceasefire between Israel and Syria on July 20th that brought the announcement of another ceasefire in Suwaida, which is the one that now appears to be in place, albeit only after those additional clashes and ultimately the removal of Bedouin militias from Suwaida city. Dr. Horne, there's obviously a lot to unpack here, particularly as the so-called Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara is someone that was trained, armed, funded and handpicked by the U.S. and Israel to lead the coup of Assad, and al-Shara seemed to be a fully compliant puppet. So it is curious that Israel attacked Damascus and even his presidential palace. But Dr. Horne, what is your reaction and assessment of what is going on in Syria?
Well, we would be remiss if we failed to mention a companion story, which is the slow motion genocide unfolding as we speak in Gaza, where starvation and hunger stalk the land. In fact, the latest headline is that this is not only inflicting the Palestinians, particularly Palestinian babies, but you have reporters who apparently are unable to leave Gaza, for example, from Agence France Presse, who are starving to death. And that has led to protests from the government in France. I think what we need to recognize is that Israel feels that it is unbound. It is unleashed to a degree. It engaged in the ill-advised 12-day war against Iran, and despite drawing reasonable conclusions about perhaps putting its guns in its holster and its sword in its sheath, instead it's decided to expand. And Syria is a very curious case, as we've mentioned more than once, because it was only about 7 months ago that the previous al-Assad regime was toppled after a decade or more of covert action and overt action by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, aided by Turkey and some of the Gulf monarchies and Israel, leading to the rise of the former al-Qaeda leader, once known as al-Jilani, known as al-Shara. And it's not surprising that his forces, when they went into Suwaida, they basically engaged in a reign of terror, which of course they had engaged in with regard already to the Alawite minority, which was perceived as being all too close to the previous regime. But I think that if the folks in Ankara and the Gulf monarchies in particular, are wise, they'll recognize that an unbound, unleashed Israel also presents a danger to their own rule. And let me point out that we're going to have to watch very carefully what's happening in neighboring Cyprus. Recall that it was more than a half century ago that Turkey intervened in that Mediterranean island, which is now split between a Greek Cypriot sector and a Turkish Cypriot sector. Israelis are pouring into the Greek Cypriot sector, and it is questionable how long it will take for these Israeli forces that are flooding into Larnaca to basically begin attacking the Turkish Cypriot sector and perhaps even Turkey itself. And I think, once again, in terms of what is to be done, recall that a few decades ago, our movement basically adopted this principle, or accelerated the principle, I should say, of universal jurisdiction. We adopted that principle with regard to the Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet. A Spanish magistrate issued a warrant for this Chilean dictator when he was visiting London. The London authorities detained him and debated whether they should send him to Spain to stand trial. They decided not to do so, supposedly because of ill health on his part. But in any case, that was a shot over the bow. We should unleash universal jurisdiction against any Israeli authorities that are traveling abroad. Understand that the Belgians have already taken up the call and have sought to indict some visiting Israeli military men that have been found in their land. Given the close ties between Israel and the United States of America, it should not be that difficult to find Israeli authorities in New York City, and we'll see what happens if incoming presumed mayor Mamdani decides to follow up on his idea that Benjamin Netanyahu himself should not escape the grasp of the law. So certainly, I think it's incumbent upon those of us who are concerned, and I'm sure this encompasses all of us, concerned about this genocide unfolding in Gaza, concerned about this violation of international law in Syria, and perhaps seeking to anticipate yet another attack on Iran. We should go on the offensive against the Israeli warmongers.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to ask you about Senegal. On July 17th, it was reported that France shut down its last military base in Senegal after over 65 years of colonial occupation. This past December, Senegalese President Bassirou Diomaye Faye declared that his government would work towards ending foreign military presence on Senegalese soil. The announcement followed growing criticisms of neocolonial influence in Senegal, which culminated in several French-owned businesses being torched and looted during mass demonstrations in 2021. The French army has had a permanent base in Senegal since the country's independence from France in 1969. Camp Gile, where around 350 French soldiers were stationed, is the last base to return to Senegalese command after several other military installations have been shut down over the past year. Dr. Horne, certainly Senegal does not appear to be in the same league or category as the Sahelian states. But what is your reaction to this news of the French military being booted out of Senegal?
Well, better late than never. And obviously, many of us are concerned about the rumblings from Dakar about conflict between President Faye and his Prime Minister Sonko. Recall that before the election that led to their rise, there was a leader, Macky Sall, who had received international condemnation from revolutionaries and progressives worldwide. And so therefore, we have backed the Faye-Sonko regime in terms of their coming to power. But now we are told, at least, that there are tensions between the two leaders. Recall that Sonko was supposed to have been president, but because of certain machinations, that did not take place. And now there is criticism of President Faye, despite the ouster of the French troops. And I should also point out the other story that we cannot talk about enough, which is that there is a discernible rise in religious zealotry, not only in West Africa, not only in the Sahel states, Mali, Burkina Faso in particular, but also threatening, one would think, North Atlantic interests in Cote d'Ivoire and Nigeria. And as I see it, in an unusual way, this is also a reflection of the weakening of U.S. imperialism, because my estimation is that when Mr. Trump traveled to the Gulf, some weeks ago, a deal was cut that in return for the Gulf monarchs, who are fabulously wealthy, to continue buying U.S. Treasury bills, helping to keep the U.S. government afloat, that they'd receive a kind of carte blanche to do their dirty work in West Africa with regard to backing their alleged co-religionists and, in fact, exporting religious zealotry from the Gulf into the heart of West Africa. Once again, we need to pay more attention to this question, because even though, as I've suggested, it may reflect the weakness of U.S. imperialism, the fact that they have to run the risk of jeopardizing their larger interests in oil-rich Nigeria in particular, given the fact that these religious zealots are quite active in northern Nigeria. The fact of the matter is that this is little comfort to the civilians who are being massacred as we speak. And certainly, I'm disappointed that this pressing concern has not only not necessarily been addressed by the corporate media, but even in the progressive media, I don't think it's received sufficient attention.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about Japan. This past Monday, July 21st, Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba's ruling coalition failed Monday to secure a majority in the 248-seat upper house in a crucial parliamentary election, further shaking the stability of his government as Japan faces challenges such as rising prices and high U.S. tariffs. Ishiba's Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, and its junior coalition partner Komeito fell short of a majority. The loss is another blow to Ishiba's coalition, making it a minority in both houses following its October defeat in the lower house election, and worsening Japan's political instability. It was the first time the LDP-led coalition has lost a majority in both houses of parliament since the party's formation in 1955. Meanwhile, conservative populist opposition groups, especially the Democratic Party for the People, the DPP, and Sansito, gained significant ground at the Liberal Democrats' expense. The DPP quadrupled to 17 seats from 4, according to interim results reported by Japanese media. Sansito surged to 14, from just 1. Dr. Horne, what is the historical significance and present-day implications of Japan's election results from this past Monday?
Well, first of all, put it in the broader context. This comes in the wake of the victory of the right wing in Germany, Berlin, the fourth largest economy, the fifth largest economy. You see the strength of the right wing now in Japan. We're all too familiar with the strength of the right wing in the United States of America. But let me make a cautionary note, which is that on the one hand, the Japanese Communist Party got 2.8 million votes, which is a decline from their previous 3.6 million votes. But on the other hand, to put this in a wider scope, the fact that a communist party in a leading capitalist nation gets almost 3 million votes in a country of 110 million is noteworthy. Imagine if you had a similar force in the 350 million strong United States of America getting a proportionate total. I noticed that flashed on the screen was the portrait of Sen Katayama, a leader of Japan of decades past, passing away in Moscow in the 1930s. He was a founder of the Japanese Communist Party, the U.S. Communist Party, the Mexican Communist Party, made enormous contributions to the theory of Black liberation through his lobbying of the Communist International in Moscow. He once attended college in the United States of America. And before 1945, Japan, believe it or not, was the nation that was probably most influential amongst Black Americans, as talked about in the book that you now see on your screen. On the one hand, you had left-wing forces like Sen Katayama, who were influencing the Black left, the Black socialists, the Black communists. And on the other hand, you had these Japanese nationalist forces who were influencing Black nationalist forces, wherein you begin to see the roots of the still resonant term, the Asiatic Black man. That is to say, the Black nationalist forces were so taken by Tokyo that created this idea that Black people actually
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.